All right, guys, so here we are in our last set of notes for this week. We've got 15.4 and 15.5, aquatic ecosystems, aquatic for water ecosystems. Key concepts: marine ecosystems are global, and freshwater ecosystems include estuaries as well as flowing and standing water. Essential question: what are the different ecosystems found in both freshwater and saltwater? Now we have quite a few new vocabulary words. We have pelagic zone, benthic zone, photic zone, aphotic zone, intertidal zone, neritic zone, bathyal zone, abyssal zone, plankton, zooplankton, photoplankton, coral reef, kelp forest, estuary, watershed, wetlands, littoral zone, and limnetic zone. Okay, so the ocean can be divided into zones, and there's several different systems that scientists actually use to divide the ocean. If you Google it, you're going to find like a million different ways that they divide this up. I'm just going to run through some of the basic ways. The simplest division separates the water of the open ocean, called the pelagic zone, from that of the ocean floor, called the benthic zone. Now, sometimes on your EOC they'll ask you questions like which part of the ocean would see the most light. Obviously, the benthic zone is the floor, the sea floor, the bottom of that ocean. Pelagic zone is the open ocean where we find a lot of the organisms like whales and fish and other things swimming. Okay, then the presence of lights is also used to separate the ocean into zones. We call it the photic zone. Okay, photic for photo, light, the portion of the ocean that receives light, and then the aphotic zone. A, without or no, so aphotic zone is where light does not reach. And then the last way scientists divide the ocean zones are by their distance from the shoreline and their water depth. And I'm going to run into that a little bit more because our book elaborates on those a little bit further. All right, so we're talking about these different zones by distance from the shoreline and water depth. We're going to talk about these ones: the intertidal zone, the neritic zone, the bathyal zone, and then the abyssal zone. Okay, so our intertidal zone is the strip of land found between low and high tide. So intertide, in between the tides, right? It contains tide pools, and then those organisms there are adapted to habitats that have constantly changing temperatures, different amounts of salt, and different moisture, because sometimes there's no water there, right? So they have to have the ability for to retain their own water for a little period of time. Okay, our next zone is called the neritic zone. This one actually contains more biomass, so more living things than any other zone. And it goes from the intertidal zone to the continental shelf depth. And on that little diagram, if you go back, the continental shelf is kind of where it slopes down and then it kind of levels out. That's the continental shelf. Okay. And plankton make up most of the biomass in this area because there's a lot of light that hits this area. Plankton are tiny, free-floating organisms that live in the water. And then you have zooplankton, zoo for animal because they're the animal-like plankton. And then you have the phytoplankton, phyto again for light because phytoplankton are photosynthetic. Okay, so they're algae, right? They have to take in sunlight to get their energy, and they're absolutely critical to life on Earth. They actually carry out most of the photosynthesis done on the planet. 70% of the oxygen you breathe comes from phytoplankton. Next zone is the bathyal zone. This goes from, so there you can see in this diagram that continental shelf, from the neritic zone to the base of the continental shelf. Okay. Now our depth in this area is 200 meters to 2,000 meters. The water is murky and then also turbid, so it's not very clear due to the accumulation of different silt on the bottom of this. And then organisms here have adapted to living in areas of high pressure. So you can see from that range of about 200 meters, and you can see it on my picture, to about 2,000 meters, and you can see the types of organisms that live there. And then lastly, you have the abyssal zone, which lies below 2,000 meters. There's a lot of really, really weird creatures that live down there. It lies in complete darkness, so nothing, no light gets down there. Some of the organisms live by these deep sea vents that sulfur comes out of. So they do chemosynthesis in order to get the chemicals that they need to sustain life. And then some organisms down there make their own light. You've seen like in Finding Nemo and other movies, those anglerfish that have that little light on that tip used to lure in their prey and stuff like that. That's an anglerfish, and they live down there in the abyssal zone. Coastal waters contain unique habitats and great amounts of biomass, and there's just a couple different kinds. We have the coral reefs, which are found in warm waters and tropical climate zones. And we've all heard of coral reefs. Lots and lots of organisms live there. Then in colder waters, we actually have these big forests made of kelp, which is like a huge macroalgae, big algae. And they're cold, nutrient-rich waters made up of large communities. And again, it's just big forests where lots of different organisms live. Then we have these things called estuaries. Estuaries are dynamic environments where the rivers flow to the ocean. So it's a mixture of salt water and fresh water. It's usually called brackish water. So an estuary is a partially enclosed body of water where fresh water mixes with salt water. And we have a lot of those around here. We have bays and harbors, inlets, bayous. These are all examples. They contain a large amount of biodiversity. They provide nesting grounds for little tiny baby fish and sharks and oysters and a ton of different young organisms live there. So they are nesting grounds, and then a lot of the babies will hide out there in the little roots of the plants and all sorts of stuff. Mangroves actually protect these areas, so when storms come in, the land doesn't wash away because its huge mangrove roots help to hold everything in place. And then removal of these estuaries actually make our coastlines very, very vulnerable to flood damage from hurricanes because it's not protected by these mangroves, so water can just rush in there. Next thing, freshwater ecosystems include moving and standing water. We have a thing called a watershed. And a watershed is a region of land that drains into a body of water, so you can actually see it draining out. And these ecosystems may be different along that river's course. And wetlands are the most productive ecosystem. We have a lot of wetlands here, like Florida Everglades, right? They provide a home for many, many different species, and they filter a lot of dirty water. They actually help to renew our underground water supply, so they're super important for us and the survival of a lot of other organisms. Ponds and lakes share common features, and we actually can divide freshwater bodies into zones as well, just like we divided up the ocean. There's not as many divisions for these. So we have the littoral zone, which is similar to the ocean intertidal zone, and it's located between the high and the low water marks. Okay? They don't really have a huge tide, but in different seasons, the freshwater is either going to be higher or lower. Then we have the linetic zone, which is also called the pelagic zone, which is the open water where a lot of the things will be swimming around and living. And then finally, just like the ocean, we have the benthic zone, which is the lake bottom or pond bottom where less sunlight reaches. Also, lakes actually do this thing called turning over periodically, and this happens due to the weather. Turnover happens due to changes in density. So both in autumn and spring, the surface water will actually flow down because it gets cooler, right? And as it cools, it kind of floats down, and then it pushes the water that was on the bottom, which is warmer, up to the surface. And this helps to bring up nutrients and actually helps to cycle the water within these freshwater systems. All right, guys, so that is it for our aquatic ecosystems. All right, have a great one.